That's something I would have found initially kind of surprising, that the regional sewer district was actually responsible for maintaining the streams and lakes. Is that something that's common around the state as well?
I think what we call you NEORSD. Is that still the right acronym? Or
I've never heard of that.
NEORSD. We always say NEORSD. That's what I would.
Okay. Sounds like a dinosaur of some kind.
It is. I think I applaud the effort to try to regionalize stormwater control. The balkanization of our communities and our societies, for lack of a better word, has led to problems. It's led to turf disputes, political disputes. You can't tell us what to do, zoning, all those sorts of issues. Sean Logan, who's the director of the Department of Natural Resources, often says, and I agree with him on this, that if we could go back and reorganize our state, we would reorganize it on the basis of watershed boundaries and not something else, because it gives you sort of a good way to manage those resources specific to those areas. We can't do that now. We can't go back and try to do that. But the idea of managing on a regional basis, as Julius said, I think is a wonderful idea. It will not be, I think, necessarily easy to implement, because there's a long history, again, of this sort of the balkanization, for lack of a better word, of what's gone on. There are some places where there is absolutely no regional approach whatsoever, and it's just, to quote Hobbes, it's just the war of all against all. People are just sort of fighting for what they want and trying to satisfy their own resource needs, their developmental needs, tax-based needs, whatever it might be, and it does not lend itself to a harmonious land use, land development pattern. It just, everybody's sort of trying to get what they can get.
So, Julius Ciaccia, is there efforts underway to try to get this regional cooperation to happen in the most effective way possible?
Well, interestingly enough, when the sewer district was established, which was in the 1970s, by a court order, or a court settlement arrangement with the city of Cleveland, written into that order was stormwater, some authority to do stormwater management. Now, it was never exercised, but we are now going back, and we are going to exercise our authority under our, what we call our charter, to basically start managing what has not been managed in this region. So we have gone through 2 rounds of meetings with all the communities to get their input, and we have now put a plan together, which we're going to go out on a 3rd round of meetings to roll out what our plan is, and then we're going to come to our board later on this year or early next year and get the plan adopted. And our intention is to roll this out next year.
Now, one thing that I wanted to bring up with you, Mr. Korleski, was really about there's often we're talking about pollution here that's coming, from our sewer wastewater, but there's all different types of pollution. The Great Lakes are huge, and there's also different points of pollution points where pollution can enter. So an issue that often comes up is the issue of non-point source pollution, or things that are coming from many different places and sort of dumping into the lake. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what that is and where it's coming from and why we should be concerned about it.
Sure, Gretchen. It's a great issue, and it's a great question. Historically, and I think when most people, especially going back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when people thought of pollution, they would see in their mind a factory with a smokestack and then a pipe coming out of the factory and some gooky stuff. Maybe green gooky stuff dropping into the Cuyahoga River or any other river. Well, that's a point source. You can identify where it's coming from. That pipe is coming from that factory. Therefore, we can ratchet them down, we can button them down. And over the last 30 years, between the efforts of the regulatory agencies, the unbelievable amount of money that cities and industries have paid to ratchet down their pollution, the control systems that have gone in place, stationary sources, believe we're not there yet, but they are much better controlled where they were 30 years ago, and we're seeing improvements all across the state because of that. Non-point source is water pollution that you can't point exactly where it's coming from. Imagine, the classic example is, imagine water running across a field, across an agricultural field, and somewhere along the way getting into a ditch, and the ditch will get to a larger ditch, and eventually it will go into Lake Erie. The classic example, and something that we're very concerned about today, is phosphorus. Phosphorus levels are increasing in Lake Erie again. We fought that battle, we meaning the state of Ohio fought that battle back in the 70s and 80s, made significant progress, but now we're seeing phosphorus levels go up again. And we think there are a number of sources. Agricultural pollution is probably one of them. People, I have my lawn fertilized. When you put nitrogen or phosphorus or whatever on your lawn, that's going to go somewhere when it moves. There are other sources as well. The difficulty with non-point source pollution is, well, where exactly is it coming from? Is there a mismanagement problem somewhere? Is it just a natural byproduct of the way that we grow crops and we grow our lawns? But it's very, very difficult to get a handle on. Now, the reason, I talk about phosphorus, well, so what's the problem with phosphorus getting into Lake Erie? Well, the problem is when you have increased phosphorus loading, then you start to see increased algal blooms, which we're seeing certainly in the western basin, and I think in the central basin as well. And the algae will consume the oxygen in the water, and it leads to a less healthy lake. So there is no question that non-point source pollution will be something that me and my successors will be dealing with, I think, for a good number of years, trying to figure out how do we deal with that.
Well, perhaps it's good for us to stop there and take some questions from the audience.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Today at the City Club, we are listening to a special program featuring Julius Ciaccia, Executive Director of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, and Chris Korleski, Director of the Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, and moderated by Gretchen Cuda of WCPN ideastream. We'll return to our panel in a moment for our traditional City Club questions. We encourage you to formulate them now while we break for a few announcements. Now we'd like to return to our panelists for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are Special Program Committee Co-Chair Ellie Sullivan on my right and Committee Member Jim Harris on my left. First question, please.
I'd like to ask both panelists two questions that I think are directly related. Last year, the legislature in Ohio and the Congress passed the Great Lakes Water Compact, and I want to know how that's being implemented in Ohio and how either of your agencies will be involved in that implementation and what it might mean for water preservation or usage. The related question is that because we've had the Great Lakes as our source, we haven't been very concerned in this region with conservation of water or any kind of saving of water, either from my personal home or a business or from the environment. And how could that be dealt with by your agencies so we had a more conserving society?
Let me, if I may, I'll jump ahead. The Great Lakes Compact, it's up and running. I'm a member, and I have a designee that sits on the Compact Advisory Board. I would say that they are still finding their way. There have been some initial meetings and sort of figuring out what they're going to do. The key thing I think that's very, very important about the Compact it does make, I think, a very strong statement that the Great Lakes watershed understands that it has a very precious resource and that intends to protect it. It does not want to see diversions away from the area, period. And it's more complicated than that, obviously. One of the things that I think is going to be very interesting, notwithstanding the compact, is we are also in an era where I think most scientists, certainly not all, but most scientists are very concerned about global warming. You're hearing things like loss of snowpack out west. We know that a year or so ago, Atlanta was within a day of losing its entire drinking water supply because levels were so low in its reservoirs. So I think down the road, the compact and the ideas behind it are probably going to be tested. If the theories of global warming hold true and other areas of the country have no water or minimal water, I don't think there's any question that a lot of people will be looking to the Great Lakes. And I think that compact, which is a very good idea, again, the idea that we cannot afford to divert water away so that basically everybody ends up with very little or nothing. But I think the concept of the compact will be tested down the road if the global warming predictions, and the predictions, depending on who you listen to, keep getting worse. The IPCC predictions keep getting a little more aggressive every time you read them. Now, I'm not a catastrophist. I'm not saying we all need to jump out a window because the world is ending. That's just not my approach. But if we are going to be tested by global warming, I think it's safe to say that the compact will be tested.